Yeah, baby girl, you're such a blessing. For this, there is no question. There's no doubt in my mind at all. This world could be perfect. It's how so much beauty lies in one person. Got everyone around you in awe. Yeah. Your light shines bright. Fun is having you love me. Yeah. Eyes are constellations. Song. What I feel is so strong. I wouldn't change a thing at all. Baby girl, you must have broken wings. As far as I can tell, I see you're an angel. Broken wings from heaven, you must have fell. Waking day, I see you're an angel. Love you is so easy. From the way you see me, as your pillar, your strength, your key. Oh, my heart single-handed. You didn't have to demand it. There's no other place that I'd rather be. Like the morning day. Oh, this world is filled with gifts. Just having you love me. Oh, yeah. Your eyes are constellations. Your voice my favorite song. I wouldn't change a thing at all. Baby girl, you must have broken wings. As far as I can tell, 'cause I see you're an angel. Must have broken wings from heaven. You must have fell, 'cause with every you're an angel. Must have broken wings as far as I can tell. 'Cause with every waking day I see you're an angel. Broken wings from heaven, you must have fell. 'Cause I see you're an angel. We believe we are. That doesn't mean I'm afraid. I will find a way. Yes, I know there'll be change. There'll be changes. Yes, I know there'll be changes. There'll be changes. I know there'll be change. Yes, I know there'll be change. Choices we make without belief and hope, there's no life. And I believe with God by my side, I'll be okay. No matter how situations may be, what the devil do, I will find a way to go through whatever. And I will stand tall. Never lose hope and be. Yes, I know there'll be change. Yes, I know there'll be changes. There'll be changes. I know there'll be change. Yes, I know there'll be changes. There'll be changes. check.
Hey, good evening, everyone. My name is Pepe Montero. I am the acting executive director of this organization, and I'd like to give you a warm welcome to Hugo House, a home for all writers. Tonight, we are honored to host the annual community gathering for the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Washington. Here at Hugo House, words are in our DNA, which is why when UW approached us to host this discussion about Amanda's book, we're really delighted to collaborate. But before we start our evening, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle. Hugo House proudly recognizes and pays respect to the lands and waters on which this building stands, the ancestral home of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Snoqualmie, Muckleshoot, and other Coast Salish nations. Yeah. We're grateful for and honor their stories, language, and poems created by all the first peoples of this land, and we acknowledge the ongoing racism and disparities that they experience. To this day, the US government has failed to grant the Duwamish people their rightful recognition. Federal recognition would honor the government-to-government relationship between the Duwamish and the United States and is crucial to protecting the cultural integrity of the Duwamish people. If you are able, consider taking action by making a one-time or a recurring donation to Real Rent Duwamish in this communal effort to support our Duwamish neighbors. To continue this event, please help me welcome Sasha Wellen, the head of the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Washington.
Thanks so much for coming tonight, and welcome to everyone. It's really, it just feels really heartwarming that there's so many people here tonight. This is our second annual, I'm just going to say it because we hope we keep it going, second annual community gathering, which we did the first one, and it was so wonderful to celebrate Bettina Judd and Kemi Adeyemi's work last spring, and so we're here back again in celebration of this amazing publication by Amanda Swarr. So welcome and thanks so much for being here, and look out for our events upcoming and hopefully in a third annual community gathering next spring. So I just wanted to first do some brief introductions, and the speaker and person we're here is to celebrate tonight is this really beloved colleague, Amanda Swarr. who is Associate Professor of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies and also a member of the Faculty of African Studies at the University of Washington. We're gathered here today to learn from her book, Envisioning African Intersex, which was published in 2023 from Duke University Press. And for all of the books I'm going to be mentioning, three of them, thank you very much to Left Bank Books are for sale, and if you want to get them signed afterwards, they're back there. And as you will hear tonight, this book, it's a really important book, reveals the long and entangled history of colonial science and racist medicine in perpetuating widely cited and harmful beliefs about intersex. And I just want to say a few words, having read talked and thought with Amanda through different stages of the book, that she's just assembled an amazingly wide range of research materials, like deep into historical and troubling historical archives, and also very present social media by activists who are resisting that history. And through all of that kind of amazing, as you will hear, kind of like sophisticated and decolonial theory and ways that she's thinking about it, I just want to say one of the things I really most admire about this book and really everything she does, whether it's from teaching, writing, her scholarship, organizing, it just like the complete and consummate commitment and care and clarity that she has when she's communicating these ideas. It's a really, it's a book that I think lots of audiences will be able to come into, a lot of knowledge through. So thank you for being able to communicate these really difficult and in all of the noise, these ideas so clearly. She's also the author of Sex and Transition, Remaking Gender and Race in South Africa. She's the co-editor of the Intersex issue of TSQ, or Transgender Studies Quarterly, and she's also the co-editor of Critical Transnational Feminist Praxis. Her essays have appeared in journals including TSQ, Feminist Studies, and Signs, and Dr. Swarr has been awarded the Sylvia Rivera Prize in Transgender Studies, the Samuel E. Kelly Distinguished Faculty Award, and the UW Distinguished Teaching Award. Finally, yeah, amazing, right? And I know there are many current and former students here who can attest to the power of her teaching in the classroom. She has been collaborating with LGBTQI+ activists in South Africa since 1997. And we're so happy to welcome in conversation with Amanda tonight, Hil Malatino, who made it here after a long, long, long day of travel, and we're so happy the sun is here to greet you. Hil is the Joyce L. and Douglas S. Sherwin Early Career Professor in the Rock Ethics Institute and Associate Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and Philosophy at Penn State University. He is the author of Side Effects on Being Trans and Feeling Bad, Trans Care, and Queer Embodiment, Monstrosity, Medical Violence, and Intersex Experience. He's also the co-editor of the T4T issue of TSQ alongside Cam Awkward-Rich, and the Care Ethics Otherwise issue of Essays and Philosophy alongside Sarah Clark Miller and Amy McKiernan. His essays have appeared in Hypatia, TSQ, Signs, and many other journals and edited volumes. Finally, he is a Lambda Literary Award finalist and recipient of the Leslie Feinberg Award in Trans Literature. Thanks so much for joining us here today. And my final introduction is of the moderator, who will, after this conversation that you'll hear, Chandan Reddy, who is also our colleague in Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, and also Associate Professor in Comparative History of Ideas at University of Washington, will be helping pass the mic and moderate in the Q&A with the audience towards the latter part of the program tonight. And just, I have to say, it is, pretty amazing. He is also the 2023 Freedom Scholar, which is for academics, activists, it's like the equivalent of the MacArthur Genius Award. So we're really proud to have all of these people in our company, and thanks so much for all of you being here tonight.
Sorry, the shoes. We do have a departmental attention to shoes. So thank you so much to everyone for being here. I want to offer a few thank yous before we jump into Young and Whitney, who are doing so much organizing behind the scenes from GWSS, to Omabop and to Left Bank Books for supporting us in this project. Special thanks to folks here at Hugo House. DK, Pepe, and Jason have been so welcoming, and we've just been really excited about this collaboration with them. I also want to thank someone who's not here, but I'll show you a slide, and that is DJ MIDI. So if you heard the music when you came in, and you'll hear the music after our discussion, DJ MIDI is a very good and old friend of mine who wanted me to read this statement because we didn't have the funds to bring someone from South Africa for this event, but let me read DJ MIDI's statement for you. I'm a Muslim dyke who loves all genres of world music. I think that Africa has the most talented musicians. My favorite genres are salsa and Arabic house, and if I could play flamenco, I would be happy because I'm a romantic at heart. Salam to all of you from Cape Town, which is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. So we will welcome DJ MIDI in absentia and show her the video of this gathering. I also want to offer thanks to Chandan for moderating for us, and to Sasha, who has worked so hard to make this event a reality, and we're really grateful. So to start off today, I wanted to share that the basis of this book is really about a chain of citations that are based on false claims. And when I was thinking about what I wanted to share with you, in some ways, this book connects colonial naturalists who made observations or were not even there in person to the personal physician of Henrietta Lacks, an unqualified prince who's made decisions about sport and who counts as a woman in sport for 35 years, and contemporary activists who are reshaping the ways that we think about gender binarism. So from beginning to end, this book kind of does a lot of work. So to start us off today, I'm going to read from 3 parts of the book to open our conversations. First, I'll just introduce the work to you. Then I'm going to talk about one of the key concepts, this citational chain that I mentioned that Hil's going to talk more about later. And then I'm going to share something about the activists' work that propelled this project. Okay. I'm trying to do two hands here. So let me read to you a little bit from the beginning. In 2009, South African Caster Semenya won the 800-meter event at the World Championships in Athletics in track and field. But instead of celebrating her victory, Semenya faced accusations that her body was too masculine for her to compete in women's sport. Sporting authorities, doctors, and the media claimed that Semenya was intersex. Over the following decade, she was subjected to international scrutiny. Her body was photographed, and she endured explorations of her reproductive organs, chromosomes, and hormones in an effort to determine her eligibility to compete in women's sport. Decisions about the so-called truth of her gender changed again and again over the following decade, as supposed experts fought about the parameters of womanhood and the course of her life. But while Semenya's treatment is significant, and continuing international debates over her body are hailed as deciding who counts as a woman or a man, it is far from isolated. This book exposes how scientists and doctors have scrutinized innumerable South Africans' bodies over the past 4 centuries to try to prove that intersex is more common among Black people than among white people. Countless studies in medical journals and books, film and television representations, and media discussions repeat the same claim. In the book, I debunk this erroneous claim and replace it with a new assertion. I argue that colonial histories and scientific racism, a contrived comparison of bodies to justify white supremacy, form the basis for all of intersex medicine. I foreground the work of African intersex activists. Thank you so much. Tori says that I'm always really thirsty when I give a talk, so anticipating. Right, I was so thirsty. Okay, I foreground the work in this book of African intersex activists who expose the material effects of such medicine and challenge their own pathologization. Writing this book has taken me more than 20 years, which is part of why I'm so excited to be celebrating it here with you today. In 1997, while I was a graduate student and researching trans and intersex activism and medical literature, I came across several articles that all made the same unbelievable claim about the frequency of Black intersex in South Africa. Well aware of racist histories of science and medicine, I began tracing the origins and repetitions of this assertion, growing a bibliography of publications focused on race and intersex. I never had the chance to fully explore this claim in my previous work, but I continued to query the wide acceptance of this problematic assertion, turning it over in my head and in conversations with activists and scholars. As the years went by, the implications of associating intersex with Blackness across the global South have made a deeper exploration of these histories urgent. This book thus explores why physicians and scientists continue to assert disproportionate Black intersex frequency and the repercussions of the uncritical acceptance of this assertion. I also want to, by way of introduction, share a little bit about my approach. So I first went to South Africa as a graduate student because the 1990s marked both the end of apartheid and the new South African Constitution at that time, which actually just celebrated its 30th anniversary a week ago. This constitution was the first in the world to protect on the basis of sexual orientation. This timing also coincided with the inception of trans and intersex activism in the US and on a global scale. I was involved in a number of initiatives at the time, including working with activists who are contesting patent rights to get generic drugs to treat HIV, and working with queer and trans activists in South Africa. In 1999, I also met anti-apartheid intersex revolutionary Sally Gross, who was returning from exile to found the first intersex activist organization on the African continent. Sally became a collaborator and friend, and when she passed away tragically in 2014, I returned to this project to write about the injustices that she fought against. I also want to mention that many of my methodological decisions were driven by my convictions about what not to do. So there's a lot that you won't see in this book. I write about and describe photographs. In fact, they're at the center of the book, especially in medical contexts, but I'm not comfortable reproducing photography that was so often taken under duress and with questionable consent. Cognizant of the violence of medical photography, I'm invested in putting doctors under the scrutiny that they focused on intersex patients in the photos. I also wanted to confront discussions and representations of intersex that are met with voyeuristic fascination, creating an intentional absence and break in the citational chains that I trace. Okay, so this brings me to the second thing I wanted to share, which is, what are these citational chains? What am I talking about? So I want to return to this concept. Same thing. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about this master's thesis and explain to you what citational chains are, because the power of the false claims and shoddy science that I'm going to be thinking a lot about is something that Hil and I want to discuss. So let me read from where I briefly define what citational chains are. Okay. No, there. Page 3. Okay, I'll read you this kind of brief definition. Historians explain the longue durée of an idea as a shift that occurs imperceptibly over an extended period. This book demonstrates that the longue durée of racialized intersex takes place through efforts to create proof, especially visual proof, of gender difference focused on the bodies of people of color in the global South. I argue that this slow imposition of race-gender abnormality as innate has materialized in two ways, through citational chains and objectifying scrutiny. So the way that I define citational chains, in a nutshell, is that they're references that build on each other to create two truth claims, despite fundamentally flawed foundations of the original work cited. They include bibliographical citations of publications or citations of ideas that become norms. So, with this idea of citational chains in mind, I want to share an example of how this work, how citational chains work, and this master's thesis. And this is from the second chapter. So you can see the title page of the thesis that I'm going to talk about here. Sorry, I'm not super good at doing things two-handed like this. Oh, no. Thank you. The creation of gender normality has deep ties to colonialism and apartheid, but it was not until 1970 and the publication of H.J. Grace's influential master's thesis titled Intersex in 4 South African Racial Groups in Durban that the links between intersex and racist science were cemented in South African medicine. H.J. Grace was trained in the departments of zoology and animal biology at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Grace endeavored to map gender onto bodies through medical subfields, including genetics, obstetrics, and gynecology, publishing dozens of articles on his research in medical journals based in the global north, as well as in Africa-based medical publications. These publications and this 4 racial groups were based on apartheid categories, and this thesis was actually written kind of at the heart of apartheid. It also related to H.J. Grace's other work, which I spent a lot of time reading, and I would not recommend. Some of the other work, it would always kind of take me by surprise, included thinking about physical bases for racial categories in the body through his studies of hands and fingerprints, a discredited body of science called dermatoglyphics, and even, this was the most unsettling one that I found, by using the blood of snails to try to prove that racial immunoresponses are racialized, right? So the work went in all sorts of creepy directions. When I read about Grace's thesis, I was surprised at the longevity and breadth of citations based on it, because this became a fundamental piece. How could a mere master's thesis that's decades old and makes such troubling declarations still have such a strong impact in medical literature, I wondered. But when I closely analyzed this thesis, I was even more disturbed, because this thesis is the ultimate source for the claim that Black South Africans are disproportionately intersex, but it actually argues the inverse. Of the 20,690 live births included in the year-long study, 3 were diagnosed with possible intersex. And in the conclusion to this thesis, Grace is very disappointed and admits that the whole research was a failure. Nevertheless, as you will see, and the example that I wanted to share with you is that this became the basis for one of the many citational chains that I trace in the book. So here's what you'll see in this thesis, and this is the kind of example that I wanted to give you to bring you into the book. There are a few things that I want to point out here. First, I want to mention the global reach of these citations. So you'll see they start in 1976. They go here to 2017. There may be more in the past year or two. And they include US, North America, Africa-based, and European journals. They also include varied fields. So some of the ones that I noted included pediatrics, genetics, urology, gynecology, and epidemiology. I want to come back to what I mentioned about Henrietta Lacks, because the first reference on this citational list is Howard Jones, who was also the personal physician to Henrietta Lacks at Johns Hopkins and was considered the pioneer of in vitro fertilization, and is sort of known as that, who parroted this same claim. And the last thing I want to mention about this slide is just this last citation, which you'll see is from 2017. So scholars involved with this citational chain routinely cite decades-old research unselfconsciously, even when it's dated, ignoring problematic methods and ethics. And this goes a lot even longer than these 40 years to hundreds of years in different places. So we'll come back a little bit more to citational chains later, but I wanted to give you that example. Now I'll turn to my last example. Ooh, papers. Okay, so the last part of the book is dedicated to tracing these citational chains through global colonial science and medicine, but particularly looking at how activists reframe these citational chains and the way that they use them in films, in reports, and kind of completely rework them. And so I think that that's really part of what's very exciting about the second half of the book. I focus on the activism of Sally Gross, the activist I mentioned, Castor Semenya, and finally activists. Activists confront the scrutiny and repetition of false claims in these citational chains that continue to the present and are used in, for example, scientific literature that's used in the present day to justify sports exclusions at the global level. Activists also create their own coalitional networks. So that's the last thing I want to share with you here. I'll give you 2 more slides. A sip of water, thank you. Okay. Okay, so African activists, and I'm reading to you from the 5th chapter here, it's the last piece. African activists have confronted the visual exploitation and racist histories that have been integral to intersex science and medicine for decades. Intersex activism on the continent began in the late 1990s and initially relied on a few individuals who are open about their experiences. Today, intersex activists have harnessed the power of social media in all forms, including videos, to publicly challenge Africa's past and present. Their self-representation stands in stark contrast to the anonymity and medical objectification that I discussed in the previous chapters. And I'll share this quote, which is from a statement from the self-defined African Intersex movement. That's not me kind of calling them that. That's what they call themselves. And I'll read you this quote, which I think is powerful. "We exist to amplify the voices of African intersex people at the regional level. We offer ourselves as the African intersex reference of intelligence for stakeholders and allies who are interested in strengthening the ongoing liberation work for intersex people's rights and autonomy. We affirm that intersex people are real and we exist in all countries in Africa." South African activists argue that the widespread stigma around and suppression of intersex means that the need for research is dire, in their kind of the words of the collective. This is the charge that really motivated me the most to write this book. They're also clear in their instruction to, quote, "put people with intersex variations and intersex-led organizations front and center when talking about issues related to intersex." While much of this book focuses on South Africa, coalitional work among African intersex activists is strong and decolonizing in its approach and strategies. Ugandan feminist scholar and activist Sylvia Tamale recommends activist strength in African unity, suggesting, quote, "Africa's decolonial and decolonization struggles must be solidified to act as one ecosystem." With similar objectives of African collectivity, beginning in 2017 and continuing to the present, activists representing organizations from 7 African countries have worked under the auspices of the African Intersex movement to issue public statements with unified demands. They envision African intersex futures that include ending non-consensual surgeries, providing training for healthcare providers, and halting the significant traumatic events facing intersex people. These collaborations position activists as the critical authority, the reference of intelligence in their work for intersex liberation. And I'll leave it there. Oh, I will mention one more thing, which is just, I wanted to end with this slide for my portion of starting us off here, because this is from actually within the past few months, a new coalition that's forming based on African intersex movement and developing that further, that includes logos from organizations in Botswana, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, South Africa, and I just think that's really powerful for us as we think about the future. So at this point, I'll turn things over to Hil.
Thank you so much. So thank you all for coming out tonight. And really just thank you, Amanda, for inviting me to be a respondent to this amazing and important, I think, imperative book. An imperative for all folks working around sort of trans studies, intersex studies, feminist studies, really anybody in this room who's doing work adjacent, right, to any of these areas needs to read this and think about the powerful injunction, the citational chains you trace, right? what I want to say is how imperative they are for the work that probably everybody in this room is doing. So that said, I'm going to stick to my script so I don't get distracted for a little while, and then we'll chat. So this piece is primarily, as Amanda mentioned, about the citational chains and the force of the repetition of these citational chains, and sort of fabricating a deeply violent mythology of race and intersex embodiment. So I had the enormous pleasure of being an early anonymous reader of Envisioning African Intersex, and I remember feeling so palpably relieved that Amanda was doing the work of situating histories of intersex pathologization within a broader framework that was deeply attentive to coloniality and the epistemological and political functions of ostensible sexed aberrance within modern colonial knowledge formations. There were important preceding works, but this book is the first monograph to pay sustained attention to this nexus across the arc of all of its chapters. That's to say, some books talk about intersex and coloniality, but not really in a sustained way, right? And Amanda does, and I think that's huge. The book pulls on several fields to develop its argument: the study of apartheid and post-apartheid racialized gender, the history of intersex medicine and scientific racism, critical intersex studies, and decolonial feminisms. And I think that the fact that Amanda is pulling on all of these fields, but also so obviously deeply familiar with each of these fields, is a huge achievement unto itself. So in this short piece, I want to highlight two of the central groundbreaking contributions of the book, though there are many others. The first major contribution, I think, is Amanda's detailed, granular attention to the work of citational chains in reiterating, reinscribing, and firmly entrenching deeply problematic and unethical medical scholarship as authoritative in modern colonial modes of intersex diagnosis and treatment. This attention to citational chains, specifically to the repeated textual links that have produced the myth that intersex conditions, in particular true hermaphroditism, and we can get into what that means and has meant historically, if you want, are more common among Black South Africans, sorry, page turning, than white South Africans, is tedious work involving not so much mapping a chain, which I think the phrase citational chain would lead you to think, as it is a detailed reconstruction of a palimpsestic textual field with repeated ideological overlays that consolidate, growing denser and more durable with each repetition. So it's one thing to like trace a citation, right? To look at a footnote and then be like, where does this lead me? That's not what Amanda has done. What Amanda's done is way more complicated than that. So I just want to sort of dignify that and mention that it's not just tracing chains. It's like messier and more opaque. Okay. She focuses this reconstruction, as she just mentioned, on the work of H.J. Grace's 1970 master's thesis, Intersex in Four South African Racial Groups. This text would become remarkably influential, which I think is incredible given the fact that most MA theses are not only unread, but pretty much unreadable. It's good to know that it was. So he is like the rest of us in some respects, and then also an enormous asshole in others. So it's amazing that this MA thesis would become the go-to citation used to demonstrate the higher frequency of intersex conditions among Black South Africans, and by extension, the supposed evolutionary atavism of Blackness more broadly. Grace's work draws heavily on historically prior forms of scientific racism. Indeed, Amanda writes that his literature linking intersex and Blackness has its origins in the 1600s, right, in the roots of colonial medicine, and builds upon them to further an effort to locate, I'm quoting Amanda, locate racial difference and Black inferiority in the body. But the most striking thing about rereading his work, Amanda points out, is that he never actually proves this thesis, or his thesis, in this or any other text. Instead, as Swarr painstakingly points out, even by his own standards, his research actually proves that Black South Africans are not disproportionately intersex. She calls the reader's attention to the intellectually lazy and ethically malfeasant reproduction of racist tropologies in intersex medicine, and demonstrates poignantly and in careful detail the real human cost: medical objectification, serious embodied trauma, social ostracism, and social death. These citational chains are a case study in white ignorance and white audacity, as well as the role that this lethal combination of willful ignorance and audacity has played and continues to play in the production of perceived solid scientific truths where there are none. Grace's master's thesis continues to be used as evidentiary, though it actually provides no such evidence. But the force of repetition, when combined with definitional work that reduces the complexities of sex and gender to a simple binary, and a scrutinizing medical gaze that manipulates imaging technologies to visibilize proof of the fabricated norms that structure this too simple binary, effectively produces the supposed truth of racialized gender aberrance. As Amanda succinctly puts it, quote, citational practices and repetition contribute to an illusion of consensus, and circulation becomes a truth creation strategy, end quote. These strategies form the core of processes of disinformation and manufactured consent. And though we tend to utilize those terms in the context of critiquing mass media, it's not at all surprising to find them honed and refined in the space of colonial modern medico-scientific knowledge production. In this discursive realm, they are supercharged or become supercharged thanks to their association with positivism and rationality secured via the practice of dispassionate modest witnessing. Observation by a body and standpoint whose identity and experience ceases to matter. Another way of saying this is, right, as soon as you ally the sort of tactics of disinformation to the force of medico-scientific knowledge production, you have a formidable sort of machine of brutal mythologization. And that's what's happening here. And in some ways, I think that this precedes the forms of disinformation that we talk much more commonly about. It's sort of honed in this form of medico-scientific knowledge production, honed in the context of scientific racism before it's deployed within the mass media later. And the history of colonial medicine, I think, proves that. So, secondly, Amanda's work resonates with a relatively recent turn in trans studies to examine the investment of trans diagnostic protocol and medical gatekeeping in relation to racialized gender steeped in neocolonial logics. Her work helps us understand the structuring logic of contemporary efforts to discredit trans existence that utilize a veneer of scientificity to propagate the dubious diagnosis, which is a paraphrase of the work of Georgianne Davis, of rapid onset gender dysphoria. The idea that more and more youth are beginning to identify as trans under the influence of a kind of social contagion. This concept, I'm glad some of you laughed. It's like, what the fuck? But also. All right, so this concept, now in wide circulation in trans antagonistic quarters, as all of you know, both the rabid ones and the just asking questions ones, began its life in a 2018 article by physician Lisa Littman that appeared in PLOS ONE. Littman later had to amend the article to cop to the fact that her subjects were sourced entirely from anti-trans parenting Facebook groups. She also clarified that rapid onset gender dysphoria was not a formal diagnosis. Yes, yes, really, you say. The historical echo with Grace's work is noteworthy. Both physicians straightforwardly highlight the limitations and flimsiness of their hypotheses, but those admissions bear no impact upon the force of repetition that shapes the dissemination of these theories. Their spread is fueled by vested interests in knowing the world wrongly, and a desire to leverage the epistemic authority of science with a capital S in defending the faulty truth status of an immutable, ahistoric, monolithic, binary conception of sex/gender. Let me return to the question of the resonance with accounts of racialized gender and trans diagnostic protocol that shapes some contemporary work in trans studies. In the latter portion of the book, Amanda provides an extensive account of the life and work of white South African intersex activist Sally Gross, who discusses her experience of social marginalization using the language of monstrosity and radical otherness, referring to herself as an extraterrestrial and to her experience of social life as a kind of dwelling in what she calls a shadow existence. Gross utilized the concept of social death to make sense of this experience of living through intensive social control, bent on delegitimating and forcibly eradicating the alterity of her embodiment. Swarr writes that, quote, for Gross, social death is a framework to theorize the dehumanization alienation, and monstrosity of intersex. And she connects this articulation to Riley Snorton's account of social death as core to the operations of thingification that have shaped Black trans identity in the US. With this linkage, Amanda builds connective tissue between intertwined experiences of objectification and dehumanization that shape intersex and minoritized trans existences. Thinking this entwinement means grappling with the ways that corrective treatment for intersex conditions, the erasure of any, or attempted erasure of any sexed ambiguity, is underwritten by the same white bourgeois understanding of gender as the rigorous practice of preventing folks who weren't good candidates for transition on account of being improperly or unrespectably gendered from accessing treatment. If Grace's work represents an effort to epistemically link Blackness and sexed aberrance, Gross's lifelong struggle for intersex recognition in the absence of coercive correction reveals the flip side of that coin. Personhood and social belonging is extended only to those willing to become appropriately and properly both sexed and gendered. Both intersex and trans treatment protocol are shaped by a long history of embeddedness in modern colonial regimes of gender. Both are currently being transformed by a loosening of gatekeeping and coercion and a demand for bodily autonomy, access, and informed consent that far outstrips this history. Okay. So, the end of my script. But what I really want to ask you about, so the book kind of ends with Sally Gross and with some of the activism happening, coalescing around the figure of Castor Semenya. But then you have this slide, which is very recent. So I want to ask you sort of about the contemporary scene of intersex activism in both South Africa, but right more broadly in a transnational sense in Africa.
Thank you so much, Hil, for those comments and for your engagement from the beginning of the book in anonymous form. And I really want to acknowledge that your comments were so helpful and influential in how I formulated the book, including the whole first chapter, which is kind of tracing this, the whole, yeah, exactly, the whole kind of colonial history in much more, as you say, granular detail. I think that was just so important. And that chapter wasn't there until it was a suggestion from an anonymous reviewer who's sharing the stage with me right now. It became actually the chapter that I was most passionate about. So thank you for your suggestion. And I mean, I just wanted to mention that because I think it just speaks to the influence that you had on this work. And also the influence came through your own work. Through especially your first book, which was so influential, I think, in really mapping out what a critical intersex studies should and can be, what it's been, right, and the work that it's done in thinking about the ways that we need to intervene in pathologization and also to document important histories, but also going further, right, and thinking about the theoretical, especially the theoretical interventions into our understandings of sex, gender, feminism, kind of all of this and how it works. And we could maybe talk more about that, but I just wanted to thank you for your impact on the work that's really very specific, right? Very material. It's not just so, oh, I really appreciated your work, but it's like, wait, you had me write this first chapter, which is absolutely. So I wanted to respond to both your question and what I really appreciated about how your comments bring this book to the present moment, both through African intersex activism that I'll turn to in a moment, but also through the way that you really, even in this moment, helped me think about the relationship between disinformation and positivism that comes across in the citational chains, right? So we talk and hear a lot about disinformation in the current moment, but the ways that has historically relied on the creation of rationality, the kind of work that positivism does with science, the kind of valorization of science, I think is really important for us to understand and think more about in the current moment. And I really appreciate your comment about rapid onset gender dysphoria and this kind of created diagnoses and the ways that work gets circulated far beyond, even when it's rescinded. And we see this almost, I don't know, at least monthly in the kind of scientific literature that's being used to justify trans, especially trans and intersex legislation in particular ways now in the current moment. I mean, I feel like every major scientific study that gets cited by politicians within a week or two is discredited, but yet that repetition continues and the kind of embrace of that work continues. It's almost like when you think about an article that's published in the paper that gets widely taken up, and then a few days later they publish a correction like, oh, sorry, that wasn't really important. But nobody remembers the correction. They're still stuck on the impact of the article, and I feel like that's really something that I've been struggling with a lot in the present moment and how to intervene in it. As far as the activism that's happening now, I mean, I write a lot in the book, as you know, about social media and the ways that African intersex activists have really harnessed the power of social media to move these conversations outside of academia, outside of science, outside of the kind of gatekeeping into a much more public discourse. And I think not only has that allowed them to share their own stories and voices and to say, here are our opinions, but I think it also allows them to reshape the ways that we think about gender and race, to contribute to a much more broad understanding of, I guess it's a kind of way to change minds, right? Whereas before maybe we had to rely on different kinds of gatekeep sources, now they can do this work. Some of the other work that I think has been really powerful recently is within the past probably 2 weeks, videos have been surfacing that they've published, or what do you do when it's a video? Not publish it, posted, right? Whoops, I'm too caught up in the in the writing world. But where intersex folks are doing all this research and work with their parents. And so they're doing these long videos to try to impact other folks' parents when parents are stuck in this kind of space of being in between, here's what doctors tell me to do, maybe my child can't speak or can't really speak about these issues, and where should I intervene? And so they're talking to parents, working through parents' guilt, working through parents' decision-making in ways that I have found super powerful and impactful and moving, actually. So that's just one example of some of the recent activism. The other part is, Hil and I have talked about the ways that intersex activism has been often focused just on a few people who, will work in particular kinds of contexts, including in these, right? So in Zambia, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, there may be a handful of activists who are doing really powerful and important work, but who are very isolated in certain ways, right? And maybe facing particular kind of legislative restrictions. And so creating these coalitions has really made a kind of much broader conversation possible that I think's been really exciting to think about what that potential is and what lessons we can learn from the work that's being done in African contexts and in the global South to learn from some of those coalitional possibilities for us here in the US, where I think there have been different activist histories, and there are many lessons there, I guess, in short. So maybe at this point, I don't know if you have anything, I want to bring Chandan into the conversation, and Chandan's gonna let you all take a jog and
I'm here now. I have just one job, which is to move this mic around.
And I got in trouble. I was talking to
Don't talk. And to open this up, Hil, did you want to respond to Amanda at all before we open it to questions?
You can move to questions.
Okay,
Yeah,
all right.
I have thoughts, but it would be
Yeah.
good to hear from others.
So I know there's tons of questions, so I will come to you, and then please speak into the mic because we're also trying to record this so that we have an actual record of your questions as well.
Hi, thank you for the great talk of sorts. I kind of have two questions, and one of them is, kind of about South Africa, and one of them is kind of about the US. So the first one is, and I'm sure you've heard this before, so I'm sorry if this question haunts you, is that South Africa is a very unique context, right? All students of African diaspora, whatever you want to call it, is like South Africa is, they're doing their thing, right? So it's kind of like, how do you feel about the generalizability of some of the things you've noticed, right? And I think that South Africa is really, I think they're really kind of exemplary in terms of a lot of the queer rights that they have. And I think that a lot of the continent is kind of figuring out if they want to move in that direction. And I think that it would be really valuable to hear your thoughts about how intersex activism sort of fits in that, which way we're gonna go. And then the second question, so I can just get rid of the mic, is about this sort of citational chain. And how I think about it is like a moving bar, right? And I mean, the reason I feel especially allowed to call this is like, I work in science, right? Perhaps I would consider myself a scientist, and it's like, these made up things is not, right? Like, it's particularly exacerbated in terms of what you're talking about, but like, ivermectin became a problem because of a citational chain, in effect, right? Like, and all of a sudden people are dying because they're taking too much of it. So I'm kind of thinking about how you think about this idea of intersex being more common in Black people, and the kind of conversations that are happening around the US about PCOS kind of being potentially designated as an intersex condition. Then, right, like, science comes after belief, right? Because then it's like people have created the reality to support what they believe. So it's kind of like a weird thing to think about, but it happens quite often. And I'm wondering how you guys think about that too, right? I will tell you, you should not trust scientists as, like, right, like, as rational, objective producers of truth. They're as biased as anyone is. So I'm kind of thinking about how you feel about, like, this like really rigorous work you've done where you kind of go about and disprove the citational chains, and then realizing that people can create new ones just as quickly as you disprove them. From in terms of like where I grew up, or from in terms of where I work? Oh, originally I grew up in Ethiopia, but I've been here, and currently I work in the UW reproductive immunology department, sort of.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those questions.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, I feel,
Yeah.
I feel like, first of all, your question about South Africa's unique context is really taken to heart. I think the South African exceptionalism is something that we need to really think carefully about. And as you said, I'm haunted by that in certain ways. I think South Africa, is also a really different place now than it was 30 years ago, and we're thinking a lot about that kind of role of sort of the promise in the early part of my research of the new South Africa and what it meant to be, for apartheid to be ending in democracy, and now where we are and the ways that the ANC has disappointed a lot of people, and sort of the excitement, say, about the new constitution that I mentioned, versus where folks are now, especially with the kind of quotidian challenges that are faced with poverty. I think that's kind of part of South African exceptionalism that I want to mention, which is, while there are all these amazing laws and practices on paper, unfortunately a lot of that has not played out in everyday lives, as we've seen recently. But I also feel like South African intersex activists specifically have done two things that are particularly notable to me. The first is they have taken, the way that a lot of activism functions is through non-governmental organizations, right, and international donors. And I think that activists have been very strategic in maybe kind of manipulating the language of donors and the agendas of donors around particular things and moving that to fit their particular local context. And so I think that's an exciting lesson. And then looking at, I forget my other point. That was the one I was going to say. I think that kind of point about exceptionalism has been, I guess, disrupted in particular ways, and the ways that we think about NGO work has been exciting. Oh, I remember the other thing I was going to say. Intersex folks, activists have written and talked a lot about feeling very tokenized and pushing back on that. And I think that's been an exciting conversation that's happened more in South Africa than it has, and particularly more in the global South than it has in the global North. And I think those are conversations that we need to maybe have more of, where intersex activists who are involved in very strong coalitional work have pushed back on the ways that they feel underfunded. Intersex activists have felt underfunded and have felt exceptionalized. And partially because of the history of South Africa, this has been possible. Because South African, say, queer activism and having sexual orientation in the Constitution was because of the coalitional work of anti-apartheid activists were queer, right? And so they could say, we want to have this in the new Constitution because we're part of this struggle. This is not us coming and saying, hey, add this in, but this is integral to the work that we're doing. So I think South Africa, because of the forced separation and racism of apartheid, has really, coalitional activism has really been at the center. So I feel like the kind of lessons that we can get around, say, trans, queer, and intersex African organizing is really inspiring to me in that regard. The other question was kind of, I really appreciate your question about, or your point about science. I think Hil and I are of like mind. Yes, let's poke holes in the fallacies of science, or maybe I think you talked about it as kind of creating a reality and reporting what they believe, right? I think that's just the lack of trust of scientists is really, the hypocrisy that underpins a lot of science is something that I've also been thinking a lot about in terms of some of the conversations now about trans and intersex that are happening together. But maybe I'll let Hil jump in. Thoughts that you have, Hil?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, so I came to really philosophy, which is what I did my PhD in, not randomly, but through feminist science and technology studies. So the points that you raise about science are like core to sort of everything I've ever thought and written for the last probably 2 decades. So yes, absolutely. But the thing about PCOS is actually really interesting. And it made me think about the fact that intersex has always been polycystic ovarian syndrome. So that is really compelling and made me think about how the history of the term intersex has always been contested, and there have been lots of complicated debates within intersex communities variously, but also within the medical community, about what should count as an intersex condition, how widespread intersex conditions are, and there are a lot of numbers that hang on this, right? Like a lot of intersex activism within the last probably 10 or 15 years has repeated this phrase about intersex being as common as people with red hair. And then those numbers, right, hinge on a very specific definition of what constitutes an intersex condition. So, right, there's long histories of contestation about this. And I'm of the opinion that, like, probably most of us are intersex and trans, right? Insofar as I think there's so much work and boundary maintenance that has to be done to fabricate an idea of a fully cis body, and like in a totally non-intersex body, that it's like, oh, if you have to do that much maintenance work, it's because there's something more complicated happening. And I don't know if people are reading this at all anymore, but there is this MD who also works in the area of critical intersex studies named Vernon Rosario, who wrote this essay in, like, God, was it the 90s or early 2000s? Called, was it Quantum Sex? Which is really making the argument, so read this, it's in GLQ. I think it's an amazing essay, but basically makes the argument that, like, sex is A, infinitely more complicated than sort of even mainstream scientific rhetoric would lead us to believe. And I think B, that really the truth of embodiment, the truth, if we want to go there, is much more aligned with intersex than it is with really anything else. So, yeah.
I appreciate that so much. And I do think one thing that Hil and I have talked a lot about that I wanted to kind of come back to, or that you and I have talked about that I wanted to come back to, is the ways that I guess just that the sex binary has been something that's been very solid within feminist studies, despite the holes that have been poked in it for so many decades. And so I feel like that's a lot of what intersex studies and intersex activism is really doing, is reminding us of the slipperiness of sex, right? That this idea that, just to speak to your point about, the kind of broadness of all of our bodies and embodiment is something that we've known for a long time, but yet we still come back to male-female all the time in every different way, including in more radical spaces. And so I feel like that's another lesson that we can kind of take forward from a lot of this work and a lot of the work that you've done as well, and like thinking about like, okay, can we let go of the work that sex is doing, and from this old distinction between gender and sex that says, let's talk about gender, but sex is natural, so let's not talk about that. You know, I think we need to keep revisiting that argument because it's just proven to be such a strong myth that the undermining has not happened. So maybe we can do some of it in the room today.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Bettina Judd. I have a question that might even piggyback on, in some ways, on this idea of South African exceptionalism, but it is also interesting that just 3 days ago we would be celebrating the 22nd anniversary of the return of Saartjie Baartman's remain to South Africa. And in the book, in terms of tracing this colonial history, so much of that colonial history about the obsession with the reproductive organs of African people, she's kind of this site of that. And so I wonder what you think about the kind of ongoing work around repair, around not just repair, and also the Alondra Nelson sense around Black reproduction globally that cites Black wombs as the most diverse, right, and of a site of interest, of global interest, because of mitochondrial DNA, because of mitochondrial Eve, you know, that sort of thing, that kind of, like, how does that interact with the work of intersex advocacy and the kind of funky, I'll call it funky science that, you know, surrounds intersex individuals?
I go first. So thank you so much, Bettina, for that question. On mitochondrial Eve, I will defer to you because I know that's your current work. So yes. Okay, this is research. So yeah, Saartjie Baartman and the connection between Saartjie Baartman and Caster Semenya, and particularly the ways that when Semenya came under the scrutiny, I write about this a lot, as you know, like when Semenya came under this scrutiny, Baartman was invoked because Baartman, you know, really documented and demonstrated the depths of colonial, the ways that colonialism really tried to construe Black abnormality, right, as part and parcel of all of colonialism. And so, you know, I feel like there's many points of connection. And one of them that's been most striking to me is through the work that you, Bettina, and others have done around looking at histories of gynecology, looking at the role of J. Marion Sims in kind of creating whole entire fields of medicine on the basis of this expectation of difference and abnormality and lack of feeling, you know, and maybe Hil can speak to affect in all of this from his own work. But I feel like, you know, there's been parallel histories in South Africa that are much less well known, but I think can really help speak to this kind of conversation about repair and Black reproduction. Particularly the histories in South Africa, there's a long history of what was called Bantu gynecology, so a whole field of medicine that was especially strong in the 1950s till 70s, where there were books published about how Black women's bodies were inherently different and abnormal and inferior, and in fact this was practiced to kind of cite these protocols, you know, in the kind of everyday medical practices of South African public health. And so to me that seems very closely linked to the ways that intersex and Blackness are inseparable in a lot of ways. And I think another piece of what's exciting in the contemporary African intersex activism is the way that you talk about, like, Baartman's remains being brought back to South Africa and the kind of repair that brought, or the sort of accountability that brought. I feel like there's a similar effort to hold doctors accountable. and that includes an effort, requests for reparations. And I feel like that's like a kind of radical step that doesn't get taken in some contexts. And so it's kind of an accountability and reparations built in that I think bring some of those two conversations together. I don't know if, Hil, you have any comments on this?
Yeah, so I was looking back at the beginning of this amazing book this morning, and you talk about Julianne Imparato McGinley's work. And so I mentioned this for folks who don't know. So she's a medical researcher who was working in DR, right, in the Dominican Republic, and published all of this work in the 70s about the sort of overrepresentation of intersex conditions in this one specific village in the Dominican Republic. And it's part of this broader sort of like fucked up medical anthropology that happens where because certain intersex conditions have a sort of inheritable genetic, right, component, there was this, it seems like a sort of centuries-long drive to find these sort of rare, untouched areas of the globe to see if certain intersex conditions were, right, genetically present and sort of overrepresented in the population, and if there were mythologies that attended, right, the causality of these specific intersex conditions. So the whole field of intersex medicine, I think, is informed by this search for the rare genetic quirk, right, that targets sites that are understood as sort of backwards, as isolated, et cetera. So I think that's another point where these things all sort of touch, right, in the history of genetics and the way that's allied to abnormality and racialization.
Thank you so much for bringing that up, because I feel like, we didn't really talk about that yet, but this South Africa is also not the only place where this kind of effort toward discovery, right, in quotes, was really integral. And I think when we look across histories of the global South, we find similar mechanisms in particular spaces. And I think that also brings me back to our conversations about what's happening today, right? Like, how do we bring some of these conversations into the present in the political and intellectual work that we want to do? Because I feel like, this is the same work that's also cited in sport contexts, and I sort of mentioned that offhandedly, but I guess I can't reiterate that enough, the way that this science is being mobilized to justify exclusions of trans and intersex athletes from sport. And so when we look at the material consequences of this kind of work, it's not just historical, right? It's very much in the present. And I think it's really disturbing. Another example that I share, and I'll just throw this out to kind of give folks a sense, because I always find it striking, and it happened like right after the book came out, or right around the time, but is that Caster Semenya was excluded from the last Summer Olympics on the basis of a decision that was made based on one medical study that was done by someone who is paid by the World Athletics, the big body that funds the Olympic, that mobilized or that created the Olympics. And this was really shoddy science. The decision was really problematic at the time. And then a few days after the Olympics, even a few years after this piece was published, but a few days after the Olympics, where Semenya was banned from competing, they retracted the study. And so, to me, it's just such a perfect example of the consequences. Not only are we left with the effects of this shoddy science that in that case was even like nepotistic. It had all these like really obviously problematic overtones and undertones, like everything about it methodologically was very problematic. It had been roundly critiqued, but no one cared. And then right afterwards, and the timing was just so suspect. So when you see folks from the Global South being targeted through policies and laws that are created, I think it's really important to try to find ways to poke holes in this mythology, as you call it, Hil. And I think we need to think about the consequences of not doing so. The question is, how do you poke holes in the science? And I think that's a really good question that we all need to keep thinking about, right? I think part of it is having these kinds of discussions. Part of it is looking at how citational chains, as I call them, which I like how you talk about the messiness of those, right? That they're not just simple links, but they're layered, they become heavier over time. I think we need to deconstruct those in particular kinds of ways. I don't know if you have other ideas about poking holes in them.
Yeah, I mean, this is going to sound weirdly reformist, Tori, but like one of the things that I've gotten to do over the last few years is talk to groups of like queer and trans medical students who are very interested, who are like, our education about intersex and about trans is completely lackluster. We don't really know what we're doing, and we're not being trained in med school to understand the intricacies of this. And I think that's heartening for me, right? The fact that there are often collectives, not necessarily even formally through their institutions, but collectives of med students who are like, we know that we're getting a really messed up education about this, and we need to reach out, who have reached out to me and other folks to be like, can you come talk to us about how we should handle this clinically? And I think for me, that's like evidence that this kind of work is making inroads, and maybe there will be a generation of medical practitioners who are working with intersex and trans youth in particular, who don't have the same, not just the same investments, but also the same sort of uncritical inheritances, right, around these knowledge forms.
Sorry, I'm just gonna. It's kind of building off of what we were talking about anyway. I do like that you mentioned like kind of the sensationalism that like all of a sudden non-binary, intersex, transgender people are like coming out of the woodworks. Like these folks have always existed, right? We're just giving them that sliver of a moment that they won't feel like they'll be harmed and they're able to be themselves. And I appreciate that. But as also someone who, works in science and is getting their master's in science, it's how do you recommend we communicate these kind of issues with layman audiences? Because it's not the people that are in this room that can read the literature, are willing to read the literature. It's the people that are unwilling to educate themselves on these issues. And oftentimes those words will go over someone's head who does have maybe less of an education or did not grow up in these circumstances. Like, I'm from the Midwest. I did not meet someone openly transgender until I moved to the West Coast. But I know many people back home that just don't feel safe to be so. So how do you open up those conversations with layman audiences? Because those are the people that we need to reach. Oh, and my name is Rose. Apparently I didn't introduce myself.
I mean, I feel like you've done, Hil and I were actually talking about this earlier today, like how we've chatted with folks in different kinds of contexts. And I think part of it is making the conversations accessible, right? So thinking about how to communicate these ideas outside of academic realms. So having conversations that are not just within university context. I mean, I think that's part of what we were hoping to do with this community gathering today, right? Is to think about like, how are we in conversation with folks who are not just at the UW, right? How are we learning from activists who are doing this work every day of kind of digging in? I mean, Hil, you've done the work of that educational realm. I think part of it is speaking about the ways that we are all implicated by the strength and veracity of the gender binary, right? The ways that we're always all working to fit within expectations of gender, right? We're all harmed by gender, even if we have particular kinds of privileges. So I feel like that's part of the work. I don't know if you have thoughts on, this is a tough one.
Yeah. I mean, I think you just have to learn how to talk differently, right? Like the way that I talk here is not the way I would talk to like a high school class. And I think that that's a skill set that you have to deliberately cultivate if you're interested in doing this kind of work. I also will say that though, as like, so I like taught in East Tennessee for a long time. I live and work in central Pennsylvania, which is rural as hell, right? And it's just, it's also a fallacy in some respects to think of like flyover states or rural areas as areas that are somehow where trans folks are all closeted or where people won't understand the vernacular. Like, I just don't think that's true. And I think it's important to just say that out loud, right? Like, because there's a presumption, there's a real set of stereotypes that's informing this presumption that people just won't get it. And I think it's been important for me personally to really sort of push back against that and just assume that folks can meet each other where you can talk across different boundaries. Conversations are possible as long as you do the work of translation. That's okay. That's great. Yeah, I would say that a lot of contemporary intersex advocacy organizations produce material like that. That's extremely accessible and really easy to find.
Hi, I'm Lucky. Thank you. I'm Stephanie. Thanks for this. Yeah, I met you too. Hi, Tori. How are you? I have a question that's not going to come out as clearly as I wanted to, but Amanda, I was hearing you talk about sex and gender. Yeah, and it just occurred to me so we have the word genderqueer, we have non-binary gender, we have intersex, and Max and I actually submitted an article to TSQ, yes, last night, that goes that talks about. I'm sorry, I was going to ask you first if I could do that, but that talks about the sex body is only ever is not a lived body. It's a body is dead, and part of that argument that I've also made elsewhere is that with these gender reveal stories, it's when the person is dead. Or sometimes seeking medical care, that the gender reveal emerges, right, in trans contexts. But it just so occurs to me, so strongly that, the activists you're studying are using intersex, that concept of sex. And I was just curious, what use that has here and why. I mean, I understand, it's a medical term. It's a reclamation of language. Is it it's akin to queer? What's its relationship to... Is there an intergender that comes with it or not? The relationship between sex and gender there is one that interests me. So,
I mean, in short, yes. I think it is a reclamation. It's kind of a pushing back on that. I mean, as Hil mentioned, there's the kind of so many medical definitions, in quotes, true hermaphroditism and what that meant. And so in some ways, there's been a reclamation of that, even in early intersex activism. And we happen to have a couple folks who are really engaged in this activism in the audience, including Emi Koyama and Amanda Sines, who are here, who have been really, fundamental to this work. So I want to acknowledge and appreciate that. But, I feel that kind of, so one of the films that came to mind that was really fundamental to intersex activism here in the U.S. was called Hermaphrodites Speak, right? And the film was really taking on that language and really reclaiming it in a particular way that was around coalition building in that moment. So intersex as language has been, especially among activists in African context, really reclaimed. And there's also been debates about language of disorders of sex development, which has been kind of more commonly used, which then brings in this pathology that folks are pushing back against. So I feel like there's many debates, and I feel like it's true what you raised about, where does this leave us around intergender, intersex, and these kinds of conversations. But the language that we're in the midst of is very contentious, right? We're always working within these really problematic ideas. I don't know, it's tough to...
Yeah. I was thinking about the 90s as you were talking. And specifically, right, the Hermaphrodite Speak video, and then also the organization, right, the Organizing Engaged by Hermaphrodites with Attitude, all deliberate reclamation projects. But also all projects that were very much sort of the same spirit as the Transsexual Menace, right? And deep connection, I think, with forms of trans activism in that moment, all around depathologization and this sort of shared project of reclamation in the face of having been rendered abject by the medical establishment. So that's really, I think, important to mention, especially in this moment where I said I had an axe to grind, but I haven't ground it yet. So one thing that I've been sort of perturbed about for the last few years is that there's been this explosion of interest in trans studies, and nobody seems to be reading in critical intersex studies or even just intersex studies more broadly. And I think people should. That's all. That's the axe. I ground it.
Yay, yes.
We both want to grind it.
Okay.
You have the grounds on South Africa and all that stuff, and have the knowledge. So what gives you the knowledge to know what people need to know about intersex and why?
Good question. What do people need to know and why? Yeah, that's a great question. And coming from my partner, I'll mention. Good question. I mean, I think that for me, the work, as I kind of shared today, has always been about working really in conversation and relationship with activists and following the lead of what they're centering. And so, you know, this project was difficult to write, I think in part because Sally Gross, who was a close friend, had passed away in really tragic circumstances, because there is a lot of loneliness and alienation that's come along with important intersex activism. But that's part of what I think pushes me in particular to kind of like move forward with these conversations, to say we need to move this dialogue to a different place, and to step back from difficult conversations would actually, I think, be a disservice to the kind of amazing activism that I've been able to be privy to over the past 25 years.
I'm going to use my prerogative as the moderator now to just step in. I was like, I have a law and then you break it. It's terrible. And first of all, let's just give a round of applause to both Amanda and Hil for the conversation. Secondly, I wanted to just close us out by also giving a huge round of applause to the Chair of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, Sasha Wellen, because none of this would happen. None of this would happen without Sasha's vision and her work. And please stay, enjoy the space, enjoy the conversation. As you can see, Amanda's book is so rich, it's just generating more and more curiosity the longer you sit with it. It's a hot tamale, so go buy it. And really, thank you all so much for coming out, and thank you both for this incredible conversation. Eat food, there's still lots of food out there.